Bizarre Reality Media. The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Reality with Shayn Orin. What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of conversational exploration into the fringes of social norms. I'm the one they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have longtime friend of the show, Robby Marx, here to share his research and understanding of the biblical figure known as Nimrod, who happens to share some connections with Esau, who was covered on a recent episode. And in the 0.5 bonus episode, Robby and I discussed the Tower of Babel and what appears to be the new Tower of Babel being constructed in present day. But before we get into this fascinating conversation, we of course have to hit the news and updates. First and foremost, if anyone is interested in catching the live Halloween special, that'll be happening this Thursday at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time over there on the Bizarre Reality Media YouTube, Twitch, and Rumble channels. And of course, the day of, I will post some live links and give you guys some more information, but hoping to see you guys hang out for that. And if you don't happen to be able to catch that, it will be posted the next day on Halloween, so you guys will be able to listen to it when you guys are going out trick-or-treating with the kids and all that fun stuff. And if anybody is interested in catching the next live episode of Bizarre Inquiries, that'll be happening November 6th over there again on the Bizarre Reality Media video channels, whatever one you guys happen to want to use. And of course, day of, we will post some more information as usual. And last but not least, if anyone is interested in still possibly winning a free t-shirt of their choice off of the Bizarre Reality Media merch store, all you guys have to do is fill out a quick 8-question survey, all your guys' thoughts and opinions on things pertaining to the show. Hopefully all things that can help the show continue to grow this year. So if you guys don't mind taking that extra couple minutes to do that, I would greatly appreciate it on a personal level. And all else fails, you might end up winning a free t-shirt out of it. I will be doing that until it reaches about 50 people that did the survey. Currently it's at about 25, so you guys still definitely have time to do it. And if you guys are interested in doing that, that link is available down in the show description. And if anyone is interested in being a guest on the show, sharing their experiences or encounters, or contacting me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys could always call or text the Bizarre Reality Media hotline, and that number is 313-364-1551, and you guys can contact me on that 24/7. And if anyone is interested in supporting the show, there are a couple of awesome ways you guys can do so. First and foremost, you guys can go and check out the Patreon with 2 tiers available, ad-free / early access and full access. And with that full access, you will receive things such as the 0.5 episode like today, along with a couple of other 0.5 episodes that are continuously always building up over there. And the next way you guys can support the show is by going and checking out the Bizarre Reality Media merch store with t-shirts just $15.68 plus shipping equals out to about $20, so about average for a shirt, and you guys can support the little guy in the process, which I definitely appreciate. And if you guys would like to donate to the show directly to continue helping out with my work and research and being able to stay up late and edit these episodes for you guys again, can you donate directly? Get me an energy drink, a coffee, something like that to keep me up through the night. Anything you guys contribute, I definitely appreciate. And the last way you guys can support the show is by going and checking out the affiliate links with some additional discounts and credits available for you guys. And I know that times are tough out there, but if you guys would like to support the show in some other awesome ways, you guys could definitely go and leave a review on any podcatcher you happen to use. And once I find it, I will read it on the show and give you guys a big shout out. And if you guys don't mind taking the time to do that, because it doesn't happen too often, it seems, with a lot of podcasts nowadays, I would definitely appreciate it, because it'll keep boosting up the show where more people are able to see it. And in turn, I can get get some more awesome guests on the show for you guys. And the next way you guys can support the show is by following the show on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, and interacting with me. Always fun to be able to talk to you guys. And you guys can also share the show directly through word of mouth with a friend, with an enemy. It doesn't matter as long as you think that they might listen to the show. And you guys could also go and catch live shows and video content on the Bizarre Reality Media YouTube, Rumble, and Twitch channels. And last but not least, you guys can always support my work by going and checking out my other show, Bizarre Encounters with Shayn Orin, talking about a lot of the same stuff, but usually we deep dive. We don't have too many guests on there. Some pop in, but a lot of that show is a lot of our deep dives, and might even give you something extra to listen to get you through your work week. So always worth going and checking out. And anything you guys do, I definitely more than appreciate. And every single thing that I mention is all available on the link tree, which is available down in that show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome back to the show for now his, maybe 5th or 6th return? Please welcome author, researcher, well, let me restart that phrase. Artist, author, researcher, Robby Marx. Got to make sure I say him in the right order for you, man. Welcome to the show.
Nice. Hello. How have you been?
Yeah, not too bad, man. Always looking forward to our conversations because I never quite know where they're going to go, but I know that we kind of have an idea of what we want to get into, and we always end up getting into these awesome sidetracks. So, as usual, man, always looking forward to the conversation and all of your research you put together.
For sure. Yeah, so basically, I was just thinking I have the book in the final stage of editing right now. Ended up being, over 500 pages on the book now. And I'm just kind of drawing some of those notes out because this is stuff I've been kind of intensely rolling through, the last few months here, just to get it to the final format, to get it to the printer. So we're going to cover the rise of Nimrod on this one, basically his come-ups.
Well, man, this has been a long process for any of the listeners who have been listening since we started the show. I think your very first episode, we were kind of diving into Nimrod and starting to touch some of your research that I don't know if you were fully compiling into a book yet, but I know you were starting to come on shows and kind of talk about stuff. So this will be nice to rebrush back up on a lot of this stuff, and especially coming at it with your new format now that you've been able to kind of put stuff into sections and kind of compartmentalize stuff a little bit. And I'm sure that you've probably come across a lot more since the first time we initially talked about Nimrod on the show too. So.
Oh yeah. And that's the thing is with this process, I could just continue to build this story out perpetually. It's just based on the set and the setting. There's really just so much to learn within the regions and how they tie together. But at a certain point, like with any piece of art, you have to get to the point where you're like, okay, I can call this thing done. So
you just got to step back and be able to say that if I find more information, we'll put it as a part 2. And I'm always saying to people, man, if you don't learn when to set down your work, then you never get to see where you've been to where you're going to go. Yeah. Because, if you're always going to go back and constantly be retouching up your paintings, all of this type of stuff, then you'll never finish that thing you want to do 3 years ago, and you won't be able to see where you're at now 3 years later. So it's been a really exciting process, man, to see you getting this book together, because this is your very first book, first time going through all of this process, right?
Yep. And well, just going from when the editor said I needed to add certain explanations about things, I was at 220 pages, and now I would say I'm about 550 pages.
Wow.
So
almost literally doubled it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But the story itself and just it's a much more solid piece now than it was. I thought it was a bit airy before, but going now and filling all this information in, when I go through it, it really has a more solid tone about it.
So without getting too far into like Nimrod and everything yet, it seems like I've been talking to a lot of people recently on the show who have been kind of, for lack of a better term, I guess, like rediscovering these like biblical characters, because it seems like their story is there, but it's not all in one area where people are able to kind of view things all as one chunk. It seems like it's kind of scattered throughout the Bible. So Esau being one of them that somebody was talking about recently on the show. I'm assuming that Nimrod is probably one of those characters, right? And the reason why it's been kind of difficult to compile this information is because it's kind of one of those characters that it's kind of scattered throughout the Bible.
Yes. Well, and it's not just scattered throughout the Bible. It's scattered throughout various, within the books of Enoch, within the stories of Zoroaster. And you have this building in ancient Samaria of the Nimrod character with Semiramis. And basically, when Nimrod dies, the story is that a beam of sunlight entered into Semiramis's womb, and basically she had a miraculous birth, very similar to Horus, very similar to Jesus, very similar to a lot of these reborn figures that have the virgin births. But basically, the offspring is Tammuz or Demuzid, and you have all these miscellaneous stories relating Demuzid to the crops and to the animals of the field, as far as being that Nimrod was considered the first shepherd. It just gets into a lot of these different things that kind of evolve into the things that you see in the Bible. I think a lot of the Nimrod material is actually pre-biblical and is outside of the Abrahamic Hebrew story, until Abraham enters into it, and basically Nimrod wants to kill him as an infant, and basically pays his dad Terah a certain amount to bring the infant to him so that he can kill him with his bare hands. So we see Nimrod in the very early stories of the Abrahamic and the biblical type stuff, but you really only see a very small mention of Nimrod, early on in the Bible. So it's a lot of this is non-canonical, Persian sources. So you're getting into a lot of different, philosophies and following the name, it goes Nimrod, that different cultures use, Nimrod was he who makes things. He was the first one that made bricks. So you have all these various, intonations as this kind of energy, this character kind of moves through these different regions.
So I guess a good spot to start for anybody that may not be familiar with who Nimrod is exactly, what his place is in the Bible. Why don't you kind of explain just the idea of Nimrod, and then wherever you kind of want to start getting into the story past that.
Yeah. So now when you get into this research, the soul force of Nimrod is kind of tied back to this ancient spirit of the dead, which some people have basically related to the Proto-Iranian Yazidi mythos, where, let's see, there's basically when man and woman are ejected from the garden, there's a serpent and a peacock angel that are in the tree as well, within some of these Persian mythos, right? And this peacock angel that's perched in the tree that gets ejected from the garden is Melek Taus, who's basically like this Luciferic kind of peacock. He has all the colors of the rainbows vibrating off of him, but it's basically the idea that he was so repentant to God that with all his prayers, that he's going to be allowed to be the first one to enter back into paradise. But while he's on earth, he's considered as the spirit of the dead. And some people have related this energy to Nimrod, and basically coming into him and kind of precipitating the story.
So as far as your research goes, trying to kind of lay down these stories, where exactly is the best spot to start to really kind of understand this concept of Nimrod?
So, well, when you get into as far as more known sources, as far as biblically, you could look at Noah, essentially, right? And Noah, his son Ham, had a son named Cush, and then Cush had Nimrod. So Nimrod is basically the great grandson of Noah. Now, from Noah, this line of Cush can be seen as settling into the area in Iraq, basically. Strabo, he tells us that the ancient Greeks considered the whole landmass of the southern nations all the way to the Indian Ocean to be Ethiopia, stating that if the moderns have confined the term of those who dwelt near Egypt, this must not be allowed to interfere with the meaning of the ancients. The Ethiopians were considered as occupying all the southern coasts of both Asia and Africa, and were divided by the Arabian Gulf or the Red Sea into the Eastern and Western, Asiatic and African. So basically, this land of Ethiopia, or this land of Cush, if you look at Ethiopia, the direct translation from the ancient in the Bible is Cush. So Cush is Ethiopia, Ethiopia is Cush. And these Cushites that were in this land of Ethiopia, it stretched all in that whole region I was talking about, which encompassed this huge mass of land, into Asia and Africa, essentially. And this was considered to be the first nation on the planet Earth that was set up by Nimrod's father, which was Cush. And they essentially called him Nimrod the Elder. And he was the lesser. And then you have Nimrod the Younger, who became the great tyrant. So you have the separation of the two. And it's also a separation at that time between, I think, the elder Nimrod being Cush. He's more related with Zoroaster, Kim Zoroaster, and is related with fire worship and kind of, when you get into Zoroastrianism, it's all about the truth and the lie. And I think when the separation between the two happens, basically when they're building the Tower of Babel, the elder Nimrod, he flees. He doesn't want to participate in it. And the younger Nimrod, he becomes strong, and he turns against God at this point, and he starts to do these abominable rituals that are, these blood magic kind of things based around the fire. So he's inverting the magic, and he basically turned his face, against God at that point.
Is this the point where, obviously, so in Ethiopia, they were practicing Abrahamic religions, but it wasn't until the apostles came that they started kind of converting into the Christian perspective of things. So I'm assuming at this point still, this was kind of like where that initial kind of switch happened before, they came back over and they started converting back to Christianity. But with that, of course, considering they were following down this Abrahamic line, this is where a lot of these extra biblical texts that come from Ethiopia start to pop up from that. A lot of people want to kind of keep them removed because they have that idea that Christianity didn't spread to Ethiopia until, after the apostles ended up going there.
He was there first.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. He was there first. So these are the texts that you really have to look into, because this was the stuff that was getting documented, and this was the stuff that wasn't fully stapled in yet, meaning that this was the time when people were starting to shift books around. Like, this is why you don't see the book of Daniel in the Torah, is because they were in that portion where they were still kind of, what do we want to keep? What do we not want to keep? What kind of fits the context at this time? But it's all still just as important.
Oh, yeah. But now when you look at Cush in Ethiopia setting up this first nation state, right, he's actually cursed by some of the other patriarchs of the time, because they say he went into these simple people and he set up these god forms for them to start to bow down and worship to, and basically give, tithing, or give sacrifice to, of their animals and their crops. And basically, and this is how the temple slowly begins to evolve and build from the excess of these goods that are given to the high priests, and it was Cush. It was Ham that actually took the people of Ethiopia, those Cushites, and brought them into Egypt and set up the gods in Egypt. So, this is the beginning of religion, in essence, through these mythos, that we can kind of, and that's like you were talking about earlier, you can't just find this stuff in one place. It's like, the story of these people, they're scattered in different places, and you kind of have to bring them together and cross compare and kind of look at how they're, and draw like these stories, through the course of research, these stories, you draw them out. It's a very fun and interesting process.
Hold on tight, guys. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to the show. I know I've heard a lot of people mentioning this idea lately that just like with reading any type of book from any time period, it's like, yes, this is the initial book, but in order to understand the things that people already initially understood at the time, you have to look into these other texts that were written around the time. It's kind of like, I heard somebody use an analogy recently that, if they started digging up everything from our modern day time, they found a history book. You could assume that history book was the history of everything, but you're not getting the full context without reading all the magazines that you might find, like Time Magazine, People Magazine. They may not be that initial in-depth text, but there's still things that kind of explain the side stories that make sense and kind of wrap everything all together. Because, even when you start getting into the point where, Moses goes up on the mountain and comes back down, and all the people are praying to this false idol that they created out of gold. Without having the initial concept of understanding how a lot of this stuff was created, it's kind of like, all right, these people were following God. Why are they all of a sudden now praying to this false idol? It's like, without that extra context, it's like some of that stuff doesn't fully make sense initially.
So now when Moses came down from the mountain and they were worshiping the Queen of Heaven, right? That's Semiramis. And that golden calf that they were bowing down to was an incarnate or like a representation of Nimrod. So, this gets all into that in regard to when you look at the worship of the Queen of Heaven and the offspring of the various god forms in the different nations. Nimrod being reborn as Tammuz being the first. And Tammuz, when he went initially, if you read like the Nabatean histories, they talk about he went in and tried to instill the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and basically was put to death for apostasy. And this early worship of the moon and the stars was Sabianism. And they say it was the first moving away from worshiping like the Godhead and more worshiping the natural order of matter and reality itself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, more so it's one of those things that it's almost kind of like giving somebody something that's like more tangible. Like, people want to believe in the idea of, I don't want to say even idea of God, but it's harder for people to believe in this omnipotent thing that kind of exists all around you if there's not something that you're like physically seeing directly in front of you. So when it comes in a lot of this like idol worship, it's a matter of like, that's that materialistic aspect of things that you want to be able to physically touch and see the thing that you're praying and worshiping.
And these, you figure at the time worshiping the Queen of the Heavens, you had the fixed stars, which were the outer dome or the outer realm of stars, and then you had the movable stars, which were the planetary forces, which they considered to be the gods. So when you get into looking at Kabbalah, each one within the tree of life, each one of those sephiros is represented by a different planetary force. So, and so in regard to the watching the movements of the heavens, predicting, bringing forth prophecy, doing these things that you were connecting to the spirits of the ancestors, which were those, the dead and ancient spirits that were locked in the earth, that some people say are tricksters that were fooling, basically saying they were their ancestors, but being, these ancient fallen ones. But now as far as here, I have a list of the Kush, as far as the Kushites and the land of Kush or Ethiopia. It included all of modern day Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Iraq on the eastern side of the Red Sea, and Egypt, Libya, and Egypt and Libya on the western side of the sea. So it's a rather, and these Cushites, they're generally known for as being the builders of the Cyclopean structures. They were the ones that were initially building these giant walls and these giant, and they're in some cases accredited as building the pyramids in Egypt, as well as other giant edifices in ancient times that we don't have any of that skill to be able to precipitate now,
And I'm assuming that the verdict behind where they learned how to do this stuff was probably some fallen angel knowledge. Is the assumption, right?
They were literally the ones that survived the flood. So these were the pre-Diluvian, especially when you're getting into these royal family lines, that they're keeping their histories and preserving their histories. These are the kings. And who was it? I think it was Francis Lamont, that he basically speculates. No, it was Gibbon. It was Gibbon in his book Atlantis. But he basically speculates that that Noah and his sons were the line of the Atlanteans, basically coming up and setting up shop again.
Wow, that's something that it's a totally different perspective. But yeah, that's something that I hadn't actually thought of before, but could definitely fit in the context. And also just kind of like a side question, because I'm sure this is something that people might be kind of curious about. So you were kind of mentioning like the Kush, you're mentioning the area with Kush, you're mentioning Ethiopia. And I know that like the whole Rastafarian movement comes initially from Ethiopia, because it's, I don't remember who the one is exactly, the president or whoever, the king or whatever of Ethiopia
Haile
was.
Selassie, Rastafari.
Yep, believe that he was the Messiah. So I'm assuming that the aspect of Kush, the region of Kush, that's kind of where all of this stuff kind of comes together, and that's where like the cannabis ends up becoming part of the Ethiopian and in turn part of the Rastafarian religion also.
Yeah.
Because I've always knew like the connection as far as them seeing the Messiah, but I never fully understood the connection with like cannabis being such a detrimental part of the religion.
Right. So now in the Garden of Eden, there was actually an area that was called the Garden of Kush. So this is in paradise itself. But then even afterwards, when they come and they settle in and create Ethiopia or the land of Kush, I think that one of the you can go back into the sacred temple documents of ancient Ur, and they were burning, like 3 bundles of cannabis on the altar a day, and they were drinking cannabis drinks. They were also mixing that with poppies and different stuff. But as far as now these among the Arabians, the first inhabitants of the country, this is basically in the Iraq region, were known as the Adites. And it says these Adites, and this is from Ignatius Donnelly. This is from his Atlantis book. I think it was, 1890 something he wrote this. He says that these Adites were probably the people of Atlantis or Adlantis. They are personified by a monarch whose everything is ascribed to and whom is assigned several centuries of life. Because, when we go back into these people of this time, they were living extended lifespans, hundreds of years in cases. I mean, Methuselah was said to have lived 969 years. But then it was when Noah instated the Noahide laws that was the same time where they restricted the years of humanity down to 120 years at that point. So, that's when we see people starting to live shorter lives. And let's see, now Francis Lamorant, he tells us Ad came from the northeast. He married 1,000 wives, had 4,000 sons, and lived 1,200 years. His descendants multiplied considerably. After his death, his sons, Shadad and Shedad, which I kind of relate to Nimrod the Elder and Nimrod the Younger, they basically reigned in succession over the Adites. It says, in the time of the later people of the Ad, There were thousands of tribes, each composed of several thousand men. Great conquerors are attributed to Shedad. He subdued, it is said, all of Arabia and Iraq. The migration of the Canaanites, their establishment in Syria, and the shepherd invasion of Egypt are by many Arab writers attributed to this line of Shedad. And basically that would be when these are the Hamites coming out, from the line of Noah that are in Iraq. And they're basically flowing down into ancient Cana, which was cursed. And basically, Noah said, they'll be the slave of slaves, basically. And so these Hamites are coming down in and basically taking possession over these Canaanites' lands. And you're seeing the creation at this time of the Phoenician people. And so when the Israelites, they're not the Israelites yet, but when the Ibiru are coming out of Egypt during the Exodus, when they come into Cana, right, the Hamites, their brothers are already there. So they're coming into a territory and they spoke the same language. They use the vowels differently, but it's basically written that this government was completely overthrown, and that's when you have the end of Cana, and you have the beginning of ancient Phoenicia and the Phoenician people.
So totally probably like a side tangent, but also just kind of asking for the sake of the years, because I know a lot of people kind of dive into this whole aspect of, earlier in the Bible, people would live for a couple hundred years, and all of a sudden there was this like stopping point where the years were kind of viewed a little bit differently. I've always kind of thrown the idea that maybe years were tracked a little bit differently, but you're looking at it from a little bit different of a context. But I mean, theoretically, could it have been possible that the life expectancy may have been extended when there was this matter of trying to spread the people? Because there was this whole thing about trying to create the tribes, trying to create the groups.
The early days.
Yes, and then once people were able to spread their seed, there was enough that people were able to repopulate and spread. Then the life expectancy got shortened as a matter of, I guess, trying to not have people spread too much to a point where people don't have any sort of abundance. Like there's not enough resources to maintain the people. I mean, probably two different ways to view it, but if you're looking at it from like a biblical context, maybe that would kind of make sense, that it was a matter of spreading the seed out, and then once the seed has been spread, now you can kind of suck it back in to kind of even the numbers back out a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and when you look at calendrial systems, you figure before the earth had flipped over and all of the water had let loose on the lands from the ancient ice age, because they say in America, we had, in North America, we had ice sheets that were upwards of 2 miles thick, that were basically just pulling up. That's why we have all these freestanding erratics and all the sand, from Jersey up into New Hampshire. But essentially, when that water let loose and the earth rolled over, you got to figure before, in the old world, the pre-diluvian world, the earth may have moved different. It may have rotated slower. It may have rotated faster, making the years go by faster, but still having the same amount of lifespan. So you have these various ways you kind of have to look at the possibilities of what the earth was, and we have this rollover scenario that potentially takes place every, fifth petal of the macrocosm of the rose petal, the Mayan calendar, that essentially reshapes what the earth is, and we have the 3 days of darkness that like they talk about in the Bible,
That's always been kind of my assumption with it, is that when you take these ages, you maybe have to like half them or divide them by 4 possibly. Because that was my assumption, is that things moved a little bit different as far as like tracking the days would go. Because, that's usually one of those things that when people start diving into the Bible, they're like, all right, they completely throw it off as fiction just because they start reading into the years that these people live till. But when you start looking at it from a different viewpoint of, the calendar that we know today hasn't always existed in the way that we know that it exists, then you can start looking at the ages a little bit differently, and you take them more with I don't want to say necessarily like a grain of salt, like they're false, but just tracked a little bit differently.
Yeah. Well, you see the bigger picture of how calendars have been used. When at one point there was a Roman emperor that instituted a calendar, and the way that he did it, it erased like a week. And basically, so this immense battle that had happened for the history, between two nations, when you put the calendar in, that week never existed. And they wrote that stuff out of the history books. So there's different ways that calendars are used. But with the Egyptians, it was specifically based off the dog star. And then from that, there's this tale of Thoth gambling with Isis, and for every time he won, he took an extra number of days until they basically equate. So there was the lunar calendar, and then Thoth gambling with Isis added the extra, 4 or 5 days that made the calendar complete. So, it's just interesting how these calendrial systems come about even.
It's kind of funny to think that they've translated the Bible so many different times, but when you start getting into the numbers and not necessarily always knowing exactly the calendar they were using, but making assumptions, you end up believing those numbers exactly how they're said in the translations instead of trying to update those numbers to what they could possibly be. But it'd be interesting to see somebody actually try to take the time to do the research, to try to view what exact calendar they may have been using at those times to try to see if they could figure out a more specific age for some of these biblical characters. That'd be kind of fascinating, but not to side tangent into something else, but just something that I've been kind of thinking about for a while that I wanted to discuss with somebody. So
there's a few different biblical scholars that have gone through and tried to, even Isaac Newton was trying to basically create some sort of chronological calendar of where all these events fall. And, they all contradict one another. Nobody's able to really, and even when you get into, carbon dating stuff, I just don't know how you can carbon date stone that's, been around for millions of years, and it just seems, I don't know, anomalous to me,
I mean, even when they've tried to carbon date the pyramids, obviously you can't carbon date rock, so the best guesses they've been able to do is the little pieces of wood or little pieces of fibers that are shoved between stones and everything, but they've said a million times, who knows when that thing may have actually been used. It could have been something that happened way later on that somebody just happened to catch in there, or they may have been using something that was way older or way it's hard to tell for sure because you can never tell with stone.
Right. Now with the pyramids, in my research, I've got several different, from the Mayan calendar into some of the Slavic calendars that actually, and even into Sauron, not Sauron, the Egyptian priest Solon, when he was talking to Plato. They talk about, that the sun had risen and set in the same place 4 different times since the pyramids were built. And then you got, Swaller de Lubavitch, the guy that funded Hitler in the beer push in the beginning. He was big into this stuff too. And he talked about from Solon's conversations with Plato that this proved when through the procession of the equinoxes, he basically dated the pyramids being built back to about 36,000 years. So, and what is it? The Pyramid of the Sun there in Bosnia, the one that has all the tunnels going out for miles underneath of it. They estimate that was built around 34,000 years ago. So there's a lot, and, this goes back into the end of the last great, or even before the last great ice age, essentially, so it's when you get into the histories, it's I could get notes together on pyramids, man, and come on and do a whole show on the dating of the various pyramids around the world, dude.
And I'm sure it's one of those things too that's going to constantly be shifting and changing, because even just in the past 15 years, the goal point for the entire pyramid district has been kind of shifted further and further back. Even the Sphinx, for example, knowing that the Sphinx is, I believe now there's things saying they believe it's older than the pyramids are. Right. So, I mean, that's crazy to think about. Obviously not the face itself. I mean, even when I was in school, fucking 20 years ago, they never even considered the whole aspect of the initial face of the Sphinx was not a human face at first. That wasn't until maybe 10 years ago they started actually realizing that it was reconstructed later on, which makes it even harder to be able to tell how old this stuff is, because every time it gets updated, it gets fixed, it gets repaired. You know, the little pieces of stuff like I was mentioning that they try to carbon date, now you have another layer of carbon dating, and then you get into the whole weird aspect like stuff in South America where you have these clear levels of different periods where stuff is getting readjusted and rebuilt, and then it makes it that much harder to actually find the initial root origin of when it was initially built. Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break, so stay tuned. And now back to the show.
It's interesting when you get into the building of the Sphinx, right? It was said that those Hyksos back to Shidad, one of the conquest that they attribute to Shidad was going into Egypt, and this is basically during the time of the Hyksos, and they have what is it? There's a city where they worship sphinxes, and it was these shepherd kings that came in, going back again to Nimrod, that basically merged the sun and the moon calendar and set up these sphinxes as celebration to ending the rites of Osiris that were going on, the labyrinthian rites of Osiris. And did you hear about the labyrinth?
The recent, what was that, like a year or two ago that they discovered?
Just within this last year, they've done LiDAR scans around the pyramid, and they think they found the ancient labyrinth that was next to the Great Pyramid. So, well, they've got all the scans, and it's, what did Herodotus say? It was 3,000 rooms above and 3,000 rooms below, and it's all cyclopean blockwork with no, so intricately carved with no wood. And he said when you stood on top and looked at it, that it looked like a field of stone. And this is where the Greek philosophers would go into Egypt to get initiated into the mysteries, and they would go through this labyrinth. And they were only allowed in the upper level. They couldn't go into the lower level where the sacrificing and the justice was going on. So
doesn't this play into like the whole Minotaur thing too? I mean, whether you want to leave it up in folklore or leave it as something like literal, like was the initial labyrinth they are talking about that they said the Minotaur existed in.
So,
which is probably why there's a lot of the weird research where they kind of know it's there, but it seems like they're kind of standoffish on digging into it, just like the whole passages under the Sphinx that they clearly know are there, but they will not let anybody access them. Like
that are talked about in numerous texts,
There's even that archaeologist, like, what was it, a couple of years ago, that was like, oh yeah, there's no passages, there's no nothing, and then he goes through that little hole in the back, and you can clearly see that there's another channel that leads up somewhere else, and he's trying to pretend like it's not there. And then, was it a year or two ago, they started doing even more of the LiDAR detection on like the front left foot, and they know 100% there's a passage underneath there, but the Egyptian government will not let anybody open it.
Yeah, but even look at, if we're to believe these scans that they've done of the pyramids with these vast shafts that go down into these block, almost like, chambers or halls that are underneath there. I mean, you figure when Ham came in and initially set up Egypt, bringing those Cushites with him and setting up the Egyptian gods, Ham, his name, they call him Kim, which is the origin of chem or chemistry or alchemy. And so this gets into all the ideas of them using these things as potential, power plants and doing alchemy or chemistry within them to generate certain forms of power, or, metamorphosize minerals, or, getting into a lot of these different, especially when you start looking at white gold and its transcendental aspects, and, it gets pretty deep, man.
I was going to say, this puts even more validity into the whole aspect of the fallen angels being all of these different pantheons of all the different gods that have existed in different places. Like the main one I've said a million times on the show is like Hinduism and the Hindu gods, because their specific religion is founded on intercourse and having intercourse with humans and all that stuff. But it seems like, of course, with the fallen angels, there was like factions of them. So, of course, there's the ones that were overtly sexual, trying to reproduce and corrupt, God's creation. So they took off towards India, and obviously the ones that were more into like the mystery schools, teaching knowledge, all this stuff took off into Egypt. And I know a lot of people have kind of had this idea that they've kind of shifted to different areas through time, but I'm kind of wondering if it's a matter of like different groups kind of having different interests existing in different places at different times. It's not that they were the same group in different places. They're all the fallen angels, but they're the fallen angels spread out and existing as these different pantheons.
Right.
Which would explain why there's no more than 9 a pantheon, and you know the initial.
Well, there was 200 fallen, and each one of them had a legion under him, you know. Or it, I should say. But when you get in, and then there's also this idea that the breaking up of the world from Zeus into his children was the same as the breaking up of Noah into the world with his children. And so these these stories kind of overlap. But again, you know, going back to the Cushite and these colossal builders and bringing these technologies into the different lands, and at the same time creating these mystery schools, and you know, it's
they all have the same foundation, that there's this creator or creators, depending on which pantheon you want to view it from, but there's this time of quote chaos that they come in and they try to make sense of, and then they push people in the right direction. It almost kind of reminds me of, if you kind of bring the story back farther, you look at the way that like the Freemasons and others different groups kind of view the whole Garden of Eden story, that it's the matter of like, you know, I brought you knowledge. I'm the one that brought you some type of like knowledge in this chaotic world. So it's kind of viewed as the same point. It's almost like they try to make the creator God look like they were the bad guy, and they came in and brought order into everything. And I mean, if you look at it from that context, I mean, looking at just a prime example with like the Greek pantheon and talking about the Titans, you know, the Titans altogether may have been this God character, but they knew that if they divided that concept into these multiple beings, then it kind of takes away from that monotheistic view, and it pushes people easier into this pantheon of, you know, looking at 9 different gods instead of having that monotheistic God, because they try to make sure that even the origin doesn't sound monotheistic to try to push people away from that concept. Which is exactly, you know, what the fallen angels would do. They wouldn't want to just say it was God. We came in and we took all this stuff over. They're like, no, there was another group. We came in. We're better than that group. You know, again, it takes away from that monotheistic view.
Yeah. It's and so now when we get to the Tower of Babel, essentially, it was at that point that Nimrod was he who became the mighty hunter before the Lord and began to be the mighty hunter on earth. And he was ruling over Shinar, Mesopotamia, between the lands of Iran and Lebanon, in the fertile alluvial valley along the Tigris and Euphrates River. And we can accredit, when we look at the Scottish Rite 33-degree system, essentially, they credit Nimrod with being the source of the 7 ancient sacred sciences, you know. So, and those sciences are, you know, when you get into the trivium, and then you have the quadrivium. So you have, you know, logic, and then you have the arts and geometry. Of those 7 sacred sciences, to the Masons, was said to be the most important, as far as, you know, geometry, music, astronomy. You know, you have all these various studies that become the fine arts within the modern times, you know.
So also, too, if I'm not mistaken, Esau's story kind of converges with Nimrod's story at some point, too, right?
Yeah. Well, and so this is after the Tower of Babel and the dispersion of the people. And essentially,
just to throw this in, by the way, since we've been talking about the Tower of Babel, for any of the listeners out there, we're going to have a 0.5 episode, and we're going to dive specifically into the Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel.
Not to sidetrack you. I just want to throw that in there for the listeners. They want more context, they're going to be able to get it. So
yeah. So now Nimrod, he was known as the great hunter, Nergal, the lion-headed warrior. If you look at Strong's Concordance of the Bible, he was called Nergal, the master of the chase. He was the first one to domesticate leopards and dogs for hunting. So he's, you know, known as the great hunter, right? And one of the reasons he was the great hunter was because he had the skin of Adam. and he would actually Nimrod would wear the skin of Adam. And in the book, I go deep into the fact that, this is Nimrod's skin, and I argue the serpent skin that was sloughed off. I argued the trees because they were energetic, like burning like coals in the book of Enoch. So nonetheless, he's wearing the skin of Adam, which when you go back to the book of Adam and Eve, which I believe was a Nabatean text, they talk about the fact that God made all the animals come to Adam and be nice to him. And this is when they were just eating a vegetarian diet before, meat eating had come onto the scene. So none of the animals were afraid of Adam, right? So by wearing Adam's skin, they could smell the smell of paradise, and they weren't afraid of Nimrod. So all the animals would come, and he could just take whatever he wanted. And so he fed his people well. They even say that he went out and was hunting to feed the builders of the Tower of Babel when they were, and because he was the first hunter, he was also the one that introduced meat eating into society. Even though if you look at Cain, there's a lot of vegetarian versus kind of meat eating philosophy going on in that story. But nonetheless, Esau, from Jacob and Esau, right? When Esau was out, seeing Nimrod, he desired these skins that Nimrod would wear. So, within the books you read about Esau, they say, they call these skins the desirable skins whenever you read about them. But nonetheless, Nimrod was out hunting, and he was away from his band of hunting party. This is the part that's in the Bible. And it's also deeply expelled upon in the book of Jasher, which is a Babylonian text that made its way out of the Babylonian exile. But nonetheless, Esau sees Nimrod alone, and he runs in. No, he's actually with him and two of his guards, but his guards are at a distance, and he runs in and he kills Nimrod. Nimrod starts screaming, and the two guards come and he kills them, and then he takes the skin of Adam from Nimrod, this desirable skin, and he takes it back to the house, and basically it becomes the priestly garment of the house that they use to bless the 12 tribes of Israel.
Just out of curiosity, when you say like the skin of Adam, I've heard this from a couple different contexts now. Do you kind of view it as like the literal like skin of Adam? Because I was hearing, Justin was kind of breaking it down, if you're familiar with Justin Doc Brown, and he was saying that, so you're talking about this idea that the skin of Adam might be more of like a religious garment type of thing, because he was talking about how
it is
when the serpent in the garden initially tricked them, that the serpent, this Luciferian character, had this garment that he wore because he was the one who was like in charge of this area specifically. But when he did that and he ended up tricking them, that garment was then switched over to Adam, and it became Adam's garment. So he kind of views it more as like a garment rather than like a literal skin, but using that context because of, just transition through language and everything. But I know from like your standpoint, like you're kind of viewing it as more of like a literal skin and not a garment, but I guess kind of two birds, one stone, like a literal skin being used as a garment, right?
As a garment, yeah. And the thing is, when you go back into the descriptions and go back into the Hebrew, the word for skin and light are like they're the same letters, but they're pronounced differently. And there's a huge association between them and the difference between them that shows that leaning on the serpent, that they lost their heavenly garments and they were clothed in earthly garments. The Latter-day Saints talk about this as well. But nonetheless, it's the idea of moving from a heavenly form into an earthly form. And if you read the Bible directly, it says that he made, skins for them and basically clothed them in them so that they could exist on earth, so they could come into the material realm. And if you look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, their aprons were given to them after they were clothed with skin. There's multiple references to this idea that they were clothed with skin as the garments that God made for them, so they could subside and exist within physical reality, moving from the etheric heavenly realm where they had garments of light, and then when they moved into the earthly realm, they needed garments to basically be able to exist in this realm. So these and when you look at the
so it's more like a flesh suit rather than like a literal skinning somebody and wearing their skin, because I know when a lot of people hear that concept, they kind of see it more of like the modern Skinwalker concept where they're like skinning these things and literally wearing their skin. It wasn't so much that. It's more of like a vest. It's viewed more of like a vessel than like a literal like skin the person and wear their skin, right?
But the vessel is your body. So when we're talking about these skins, I'm talking about the literal skin of the first man that was preserved, and then the skull. The bones were separated out and the skull was taken to Golgotha, and that became where Jesus was crucified, in the mystery of Golgotha, the place of the skull. But if you get into the word that they use for the skin in the Bible, and you trace that back and look at all the other examples within the biblical canon that use that word for skin, it's all referring to the skin of an animal or the skin of a human. And in all cases, they're already dead, except for one case, it refers to the skin of a live animal. So, all these cross comparisons, I've gone through and looked at it 10 ways to Sunday. And there's one rabbi that says that the serpent sloughed off his skin and that was where the skin came. But this is a much later statement, right? There's also within the book of, which one is it? The book of the Cave of Treasures. They talk about the fact that God took the skins of the trees and made them garments that were softer than any fabric that's ever been made. But when you look at the trees within paradise, they're constantly referred to in the more esoteric texts as energetic forms that are generating like light and moving light like a torrid field almost, and that they're burning and basically are red hot and glowing like charcoal, so because we're talking about in the heavenly realm, these are more etheric light trees, so that kind of dismisses in my mind the idea of making skins out of the bark of these trees. And I've looked at all these different stories, and I've come down to, in everything that I see, that this is indeed the skin of the first human that is preserved after his death by his children, and basically, as a holy remnant from paradise, so and then that is gathered up at the flood and basically taken across. And there's two different lines of story in the thinking of it. One, that it was handed down through Shem, which became Melchizedek, and the other one that was, stolen by Ham. And if you compare these two stories, and we're going to take the Bible as correct, then Esau, killing Nimrod and cutting off his head and taking these garments leads me more to think that it was indeed that these garments were stolen by Cush and stolen by Ham and passed down to Cush and then given to Nimrod for his love of him. And this is in the book of Jasher that goes big into that, which Madame Blavatsky talks about quite a bit as well.
Kind of a strange thing to think about that I was kind of thinking about while you were kind of describing this. So in the Garden of Eden, of course, everybody's naked. And then, once they become aware of everything, then they are aware of the fact that they're naked. And then that's when they start to, you have to wear garments and everything. So the whole initial idea of like wearing skin or wearing garments in general is, I guess, more of a corrupt idea than it is like the natural intended way that God intended things to be.
Right.
But when you look into like these angels, for example, you're talking about like the garments of the angels and everything. Kind of a weird thing to think about that, God didn't intend for humans to wear garments, but yet the angels wore garments. But then once we became aware of things and we actually started to wear garments, which obviously, like I said, is almost like a corrupted idea if you really think about it to begin with, we started taking these garments and creating like religious aspects out of them, which in a weird way kind of seems like it's a corrupt concept to begin with. Just kind of something weird to think about.
Yeah.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to that deep conversation you crave.
But also to show that too, I mean, wouldn't that almost show that if the angels were already wearing garments when we were talking about the Garden of Eden story, does that mean that there was already corruption within the angels before the Garden of Eden story even fully started, to the point where they were fully aware and were wearing garments? So then, I don't know, just kind of a weird thing to think about, that God never intended that, but yet they were already wearing garments,
when you get into that, they talk about them more in the idea of heavenly vestitures, garments of light. So it's basically, I think that maybe it's along the idea that every successive level you move deeper into matter, from the pure etheric, unbound, uncorrupted, heavenly place that Lucifer fell from, where there was no decay or no aging, right? That as you fall into the material matrix, the further you fall, you need different vestmentures to be able to protect yourself within those realms, like how we need our skin.
Or like an armor or something, almost, that in order to be able to come down here and interact with man, they almost need to be like protected to a certain point. And then even on the other side too, we're thinking about garments like covering stuff up. With the angels, it might be a little bit different in that aspect. We're talking about it in the aspect of like, possibly using it for like protection, but we already know that there's a hierarchy within angels. So when we're talking about these garments, it may not be, again, garments to cover up, but possibly garments to be able to show where their existence is in the hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
Almost like a badge of honor or something like that, for lack of a better term, or just to clearly state their place.
Right. But now this skin, when Nimrod became the first Skinwalker, this is when he starts to, he turns against his father's belief systems, worshiping the higher etheric forms of resonance back to the monad. And he basically starts to worship and focus on denser, darker, more going into the earth, and these old entities that are locked away, instead of, moving higher. So, Nimrod, through the course of this, basically becomes a sort of a black magician, Skinwalker, participating in, when you get into the Canaanites and getting into the cannibalism, they were said to paint blue rings around their eyes, and they would drum and do their blood rituals, and it gets into I've got the name of the whole thing here. Let me see if I can find it, but it's basically where is it? Yeah, so here we have, and Nimrod with the priests of Baal were said to have revived the cult of the cannibal. These high priests of Baal were known for their cannibalistic rites, were said to have brought back the rites of the Cyclopeans, revering the act of eating human flesh in ritual form called anthropophagia. Anthropos, which means man, and Fijian, Phagein, Fijian, means to eat. And they called this the referee ritus cyclopeum, the rites of the cannibals, of the eating of the flesh. So it starts to get really dark, with the second Nimrod, and they've got the fire worship going on, and they're like Nimrod in some of the descriptions. like in the book in Revelations with the woman clothed in the sun standing on the moon with the 12 stars above her head. This is related back to an image of Nimrod as being that red dragon, basically perched there to eat the children as they were born. Much like Saturn, we see eating his children. We see these various different god forms, that, what's the Funkadelic album, America Eats Its Young. It's it gets into some crazy stuff as Nimrod kind of moves along,
Just out of curiosity, and I don't know if you actually ended up like digging this up fully, but like, do you know like what his like paradox was for like the afterlife? Because kind of a weird thing to think about. Everybody kind of thinks about this whole like heaven and hell concept, but if you really start diving into stuff, it's not as it's described. I mean, I don't know exactly where it sits or like when exactly like the split really starts, but in the Old Testament, they kind of talk about this idea that when things die, they kind of just exist in this place of non-existence until the point where they are pulled from that and brought into existence. So when you have people like Nimrod that are starting to get into worship of these like other gods and everything, do you know like what some of the promises or anything they may have been promised by these things are to follow them? Like, do they promise them a different afterlife, or did they kind of view things at this point as, no matter what, I'm going to be going to this place where I'm just kind of existing with everybody, so it's kind of irrelevant what I do in this life? Like, what do you know what their kind of viewpoint of the afterlife was when they're starting to get into this more dark worship at this time? Because it seems like, the only benefit is to follow God at this time. So if you're not, like, I don't understand, like, how many of these figures got into this type of stuff,
Yeah. Now you figure at the time when you look at the arguments between Jacob and Esau, and you go back to, Manly P. Hall talking about the Atlantean black magicians, they had no ability to be able to capture the etheric creative light that mankind had, because we had been created as higher etheric beings, being able to transition through the multiple heavens through transubstantiation, basically ascend into higher forms, right? Whereas these angelic forms, these fallen ones, they were like building blocks of the universe and they couldn't ascend. So they're kind of trapped in this realm. And it's this whole idea of within this realm, what do you have? You have pleasure and you have power. So, within the earthly realm, Nimrod was going around and taking power, and creating these different mystery schools with these labyrinthian kind of ritual sex magic. He was the first cuckold, basically. Semiramis would basically be the Scarlet Lady, and Nimrod would basically watch the sexual rites. And the term that he took was cuckold. So it gets into a lot of these priestly things of abstaining from sex, but they were using these sexual rites to basically alchemize the soul, bringing the male energy and the female, the fire and the water together, and alchemizing them into that steam where the soul would through these rituals leave the body and in an alchemized form come back with prophecy or messages or things that they had learned from the other side. It's some interesting stuff, man.
So the whole intention wasn't necessarily that they would ever end up in heaven or anything. It was more so this whole idea about trying to tie and attach yourself to the materialistic world, so you pull yourself back in.
Yeah.
Which kind of weirdly enough, man, gets into this whole thing that I've been saying about like the conspiracy of the paranormal, that I think the whole idea of the paranormal is a lot different than what people think it is. And I think that the whole reason why on TV shows, all this stuff, they make it look like it's this ridiculous, like, oh no, I got scratched by this, I got scratched by that, oh no, blah, 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 blah. I think that the elites, for lack of a better term, have a lot more of an understanding of the paranormal realm, and they see it more as this place where they can transfer consciousness rather than like the soul realm. So everybody's kind of viewing the paranormal realm as this realm that their dead ancestors are in, that all these people are in. But I almost kind of see it more as, I guess you could say, more of like this purgatory realm where you're existing in this place, and as long as that full tether isn't cut, you might be able to pull yourself back in possibly. And the reason why they don't there's so much government study on this realm, but yet there's not that much information that really seems to come out to the public, is because they know that you can transfer consciousness in this realm, but they kind of just leave it as this like, woo, it's the ghost, it's a paranormal realm,
But look at the CIA declassified papers on the gateway process,
Oh yeah, dude. I mean, in 1988, I mean, they were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. So, I mean, with all of this stuff, they're obviously doing all this stuff where they're astro traveling. They're doing all this stuff with these like mind experiments and everything. But in the process of that, the aspect that gets weird is that they kind of throw all the idea about like Hitler looking for all of these like occult objects, looking for all of these different biblical artifacts. But little do a lot of people know, they're looking for him just as much, which even more so adds validity to the whole Bible story, that a lot of people want to throw it off as fiction. But again, like, why is the government looking for the Ark of the Covenant and seeing it as this weapon that has this potential power to do they're not even aware of? They just kind of know like the Walls of Jericho story. But
and then you get into the released emails and Hillary looking for the resurrection chamber of Gilgamesh,
which would have been Nimrod, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
Exactly. Because
they're talking about the whole Nimrod's, or the whole story of Gilgamesh. And what was his the other guy that was with him?
Enkidu.
And Enkidu is Esau. So you're just looking at Nimrod and Esau, and it's just in a different context. And then even connecting in with that story, you even have references to Noah and the Great Flood too. So I mean,
and Gilgamesh went and looked for, what was his name? There was a Noah character that had survived the flood, and Gilgamesh went to him looking for the breath of eternal life. So Gilgamesh, Nimrod is going to Noah, and then
it gets stolen by a snake too, just to throw that in, which makes it even funnier.
I know. So now let me
which is kind of a weird thing to think about, if you think about, because it's almost symbolic in a weird way too, because think about it this way: the Garden of Eden, eternal life. Who takes the eternal life? It's the serpent.
The serpent.
So even just viewing it from another context, I mean, that's almost part of the Garden of Eden story in a weird way too, because the serpent steals eternal life.
Is revered within the mystery schools. They look at it as a majestic animal that glides on the earth with no legs, that sheds its skin and renews itself every year. So and it's looked at as a wisdom animal. So it's again, dating back and following back to these ancient fallen spirits.
And doesn't the snake eat the flower that he's trying to get to? So the snake ends up getting eternal life, which even in another context, if you view Lucifer as that snake, he takes eternal life from man so that he can have eternal life in this realm. Like, weird thing to think about.
And that was in the legend of the Golden Flower, or in the story of Gilgamesh visiting the Noah character. That is attributed to when the snake begins to shed its skin and have these, many lives. So, So, but now Nimrod, right? He went up from the east and began to practice the art. Okay, hold on. Let me go to the one before this. So, so Nimrod, he went to Yokdora of Noda. And when he arrived at the lake of Atras, he found there Yonton, the son of Noah. And it says this is a Syriac text, and it says in the notes that Noah begot this Yonton after the flood, and he honored him in many things and sent him to the east to dwell there. But nonetheless, Nimrod comes to this son of Noah, and he went down and bathed in the lake and came to Yonton and did homage unto him. And Yonton said, "Thou art a king. Dost thou do homage to me? Like, why are you, bowing down to me?" And Nimrod said, "It is because of thee that I have come down here." And he remains with this Yonton character for 3 years. And Yonton, he teaches him the art of revelation and divination. And basically after 3 years, he sends him away and says, "Come back to me not again." So, Nimrod's going to basically another son in the line of Noah and learning these ancient practices of communicating and gaining revelation and divination. And it says, And Nimrod went up from the east and began to practice the art of divining. Very many men marveled at him. And then it gets into this priest that worked under him, that he wanted the secrets too. And so he ended up calling up the devil. And the devil basically just corrupts him and ruins his whole life. And, because he's trying to learn the secrets that Nimrod learned. It's some interesting stuff, man.
Inquiries About Reality will return after this quick commercial break. And we are back, so let's hop right in.
And I mean, this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm assuming that King Solomon was directly influenced by Nimrod.
Well, King Solomon coming out of the line of David,
which is a weird thing to think about, that David is one of those people that like everybody looks up to David, like he was one of the greats. But, I'm not talking bad about David or anything, but he was the one who, basically sent off his friend to die so that he could take his wife. Yeah. And in turn, his firstborn son ends up dying. And then later on, he leads into King Solomon. And that's like one of those parts of the Bible that he's viewed two different ways. People really, really love him, but they also really hate him at the same time. But either way, it seems like most of the time, the typical church storyline leaves out 99.9% of the King Solomon stuff. It's like Second Temple, jump fast forward 400 years.
Yeah. It's because that's, and when you get into Solomon, he's coming from this lineage of David that is basically supplicating to the rising storm god of Yahweh. And so, but they tell David he can't build the temple because he has so much blood on his hands. And so basically... And
he wants to call it his temple too the whole time. He's like, this is my temple, this is my temple. And there it's like, it's the exact reason why you can't be the one that builds the temple is because you're calling it your temple. It's a temple for God, not for you.
He lays away all these gold and silver and different resources, for Solomon. And then you have Hiram Abiff, or not Hiram, but King Hiram, basically sending an artisan named Hiram that was the offspring of a Phoenician and a Danite that comes in and becomes the Masonic idea of Hiram Abiff in the building of that. But it wasn't until, as far as the relation to these darker arts with Solomon, it wasn't until later when he had the 700 wives and 300 concubines, and he's making all these deals, and he starts building temples to these other gods to make these prosperous deals with these different nations. And his wife that he takes on, she's basically coming out of this religion on the other side, coming from these the darker forces per se. And it's at the point she gives him 3 locusts, and Solomon crushes them in his hand and eats them in dedication to Moloch, who one of his wives worshipped basically. And because of that action, the spirit that Yahweh, the wisdom that Yahweh had given him, Yahweh took away Solomon's wisdom. And that was when Solomon kind of fell off. And that's also when you have all of the ring and summoning up the various demons and bringing, and using all these forces to build this temple, And
I'm assuming that this is kind of the point where I guess it's kind of like the start of the fall, because it's like 400 years later, if I'm not mistaken, is when the temple gets destroyed, and that's when everybody gets exiled and everything. But I'm assuming that that was the point where God would have started to say, like, all right, these people are starting to go off in the wrong direction. And it's almost like he needed to destroy what he had already built in order to reconnect people's faith, because that's obviously what falls into like Daniel and everything, where, he gets put in front of the lions. He has the story about when all the people are praying to the false idol. He takes 3 of the men that refuse to bow down. He throws them in the flames, and then the extra person pops up and ends up saving all of them and bringing them back and everything. But it seems like King Solomon is like the start of like when that fall needs to happen because, again, not a lot of people hear too much about Solomon. You hear about Solomon and you just assume that, he's part of the house of David. He must have been great because he was part of the house of David, not realizing that he was literally doing these rituals that were praying to like Moloch and all of these other different entities, which assumably, when you have your king that's starting to do this stuff, the people are going to follow.
Yeah, yeah. And now the Moloch, that temple to Moloch that was built around the Temple Mount, that after the temple of Moloch had fallen, that is the same site where Jesus ends up coming and standing on the old site of the temple of Moloch, which overlooks, down on the temple. And that's where he gave the Mount of Olives, little dispersion there.
Oh, wow. Also kind of another question. So when they're talking a bit earlier in the Bible about where we were talking about earlier with Moses, when he comes down and, they're all praying to this like false idol of Moloch. I know in the initial Bible, it doesn't call that Moloch at that point. Is it not, just if you know the answer to this question, is it not till they start getting into the King Solomon stuff that they kind of put the entity Moloch, idea of Moloch going back into that point in the Bible?
Yeah, so Moloch actually goes back to ancient Samaria, also ties in with the Druids. That becomes Baal or Adon, all these different terms for Lord. Moloch.
Because they just really call it a golden calf at that point, if I'm not mistaken, right? They don't actually use the terminology Moloch.
Right. But Moloch is just the term for king, is all it really is. And Moloch was the secret occulted name of Nimrod. And when you go back into ancient Babylon, Moloch was what they called the king. But it gets into going back into the Star of Rephesh and going back into Egypt and this worshiping of Saturn, right? And Saturn, Lord Ra, was representative as the Lord of Time, like Saturn, but Saturn was said to be the first one that had a crown, right? Nimrod was said to be the first king to wear a crown. So there's all these things that tie in that link Saturn with Nimrod, with just handing down through these, and that golden calf was one of those symbols. The bull, or the calf was the symbol of Tammuz or Nimrod. So
a lot of people like to think that all of these different figures and everything like that existed outside of the Bible. But it seems like when you start getting into a point with all of this stuff, it just seems like all of it kind of falls into the same context, that it's all just a matter of like viewpoint and how you kind of describe these things. Because, when you start looking into like Moloch or all these different entities, all these different types of beings, like it seems like, they're coming from like a totally different region, but that region wasn't necessarily aware of these things' names and everything yet. So when people try to like view, oh, this person fits this context, this person fits this context, this person fits this context, that means that the Bible, it doesn't mean anything at that point because these characters already existed in these other places. It's not that they aren't the same character. It's just that they were documented earlier in these other places. It doesn't take any more validity away from the other text. It just kind of shows that all of these texts are part of a bigger story, and it's just a matter of what context you want to try to kind of view them through. But, no matter what way you end up trying to view it, it seems like you have these reoccurring factors that pop up everywhere. So there is a truth to it. It's just a matter of, again, like which perspective a lot of people want to view things through.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, George Ralston, in his book, he says, besides incense consumed in his honor, bulls were also sacrificed to Baal, and probably horses too. The Persians at least sacrificed the latter to their sun god, but the principal sacrifice was children. And the so we have Baal within, this more Eastern Semitic type region, right? And then we also have Baal that we see following into the Druids, and so there's this with ancient Kush being related to Zoroaster and the creation of the Magi. Essentially, they said there was the Eastern Kadash and there was the Western Kadash. And the Eastern Kadash were the Magi, and the Western Kadash were the Druids. So these are basically coming from the same root, but they were sent out. And I was going to get into it more. Maybe we'll have to cover it another time. But after the fall of the Tower of Babel, when you get into the Book of Invasions, when you get into, there's a couple different texts that talk about they basically made schools of the different languages, and they would basically teach these clans the languages. And if you get into Islam within the Holy Quran, they talk about a book. The first book ever was handed down to Idris, which Idris is related to Thoth, which is related to Cush again. But this first book that was handed down from the heavens in Muslim theology was said to be a book that contained 1,181 languages. And if you look up that number, it's the place of desolation, basically. But nonetheless, these different languages, it said if you understood one thoroughly, you couldn't understand the others because the complexity between the different languages was so much, right?
That's even true now, man. I've talked about that with a million people about trying to learn other languages. Like I've tried myself so many different times, but because my vocabulary is expanded the way that it has in English, it makes it almost impossible to communicate in other languages because
the structure.
Yeah, even just to be precise with the way you describe a language, because it seems like a lot of the time the people that can speak a bunch of different languages, I mean, of course there are some people that just have those different brains and they're really precise, but for the most part, people that are like bilingual and can speak 10 different languages, they're not, it's kind of like the master or the jack of all trades concept. Like they're not extremely skilled in one specific language. They're kind of rudimentary and they have like one adjective for a lot of different things in multiple different languages, where if you're really, really good at one language, you have 10 different adjectives for this one thing, but it makes it that much harder to learn the other languages. It's almost like a fail-safe in there, you know, when you get into the whole Tower of Babel concept. It's like a fail-safe that the more you understand your language, the less of a possibility you'll ever be able to understand another language.
Right.
Even just the sentence structure. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. I mean, I don't know how many people that are English speakers have really like taken the time to look into other languages, but like sentence structure from English to other stuff is beyond ridiculous. Like that's why if you know English first as your primary language, it makes it that much harder to learn any other language.
Because they're not any of the ancient dead languages. English is a completely new, from Chaucer on, it becomes this new creation. Shakespeare, I don't know, he created tons of new words. Chaucer created tons of new words.
Even during Shakespeare's time, he was one of the main people that started actually setting, this is how things are spelt. Like up until Shakespeare's time, it wasn't that this is the definite spelling of something. It was just a matter of, if you can put it on paper and people can read it, that's how you spell it. Like there wasn't defined spelling.
Chaucer, if you go read Chaucer, it gets hard, but you can it takes some time to figure out the words, but once you do, it's like, oh, that makes sense, so now the Druids, in regard to the Druids, right, they also worshipped and offered human children as sacrifices to a form of a Baal or Lord, and they said that these sacrifices were considered that the fruit of the body was offered for the sin of the soul. So, and if you get into, he's an old Egyptian researcher. I'll remember his name in a second. But he said that basically in ancient times that all of these sacrifices of the children relate to early law that the first birth of every womb had to be sacrificed. And this took time for them to phase out. In regard to Abraham not sacrificing Isaac, that being the point where they said that human sacrifice ended. And then Jesus, when he comes and he says, I am the sacrifice now, eat my flesh and drink my blood, that he's ending all sacrifice, not just human or, but animal and everything, that there'll be no more blood sacrifice within this realm, but the blood was always the powerful thing, and if you go back to ancient Samaria, they talked about the creation of the humans basically as like a livestock. They were like workers, and that basically their blood was the oil that greased or lubricated the turning gears of the cosmos. So it's
that almost kind of sounds like the reptilian / like draconian concept. I mean,
right?
Again, talk about the whole idea about all these stories exist. It's just a matter of viewing them in the right context.
Interpretation.
Like even the whole Esau thing, to bring that one up for the millionth time. Yeah. They talk about him being fully covered in like red hair. It's like, how many times have people read over that? But unless you have the right context that you're thinking about these like Sasquatch-like beings or these Nephilim beings that are possibly related to Sasquatch, it's like you can pass over that a million times and not fully understand the context.
Yeah. Well, and even when you look at the blessing of the 12 tribes of Judah, 12 tribes of Israel, it's his mother, Jacob and Esau. So Jacob's mother, she sends Esau out to get a meal for Isaac for the blessing. And while he's gone, she kills a goat and cuts up the skins and wraps them around Jacob's wrists and his neck, so that when he goes in for the blessing from Isaac, that when Isaac feels him, he's like, oh yeah, you're hairy like Esau. So, even the outfit that they prepared, for Jacob to get the blessing, they had to basically affix these skins, these hairy goat skins on Jacob, so that he would appear to feel as Esau was.
And I mean, even expanding farther into that story, man, you're already kind of talking about him a little bit, the cannibal tribe. I mean, I recently did something talking about like vampire lore and going back to like ancient Mesopotamia and everything like that. And it almost kind of seems like
the Stragori.
Yeah, exactly. That the whole vampire lore thing also fits in with the context of the Bible. And even with that, I mean, I was kind of mentioning on the vampire show, the whole thing about Uncanny Valley, that we clearly have this thing that's in our heads that makes us fear something that looks exactly like us. Like there has to be some type of like origin to that. And if you're looking at it from this biblical text that possibly explains Bigfoot, possibly starts talking about these vampiric entities, I was mentioning on the show, I don't think that by no means the Hollywood idea of what people think vampires are is by no means what the ancients were speaking of when they talked about vampires. And diving into some of the lore that I was talking about, like none of like the idea that we think of as the modern day vampire was all strictly created by Bram Stoker's Dracula. But before that, it was a totally different concept. If you're looking at the old concept of vampires, then I mean, it could definitely fit in the paradigm that, these are something that may possibly exist, that there are these things that have learned that if you consume the blood of humans, that it's that life essence, it's that life force. And of course, there's all these fail safes that they've put together, like, if you drink the blood of a human, you're going to go to jail, or you're going to go to jail, you're going to go to hell, you're going to go to this place or whatever. So they're kind of learning how to preserve the power for themselves, so to speak, in a weird way. Not saying that by any means you should consume, human flesh or blood or anything like that, but
well, and that gets into after Noah landed, and the creation of the Noahide laws was one of them specifically was no drinking blood from live animals. Or no, just drinking blood, basically. But that, and then you go back into the ancient stories of Lilith and her sister, and basically, being a sort of vampiric being that would take married men and drain them of their essence, and then steal the children and take them to Lilith for her to eat them. It's some scary, dark stuff, man.
And I mean, that context definitely makes a lot more sense than the whole idea of this creature coming up, biting you on the neck and sucking your life out and possibly turning into one of them. I don't think it's a matter of anybody turning into one of these things. It's just a matter of that's part of where the romance folklore kind of started coming in later on. But these things would just essentially consume your life force, and that'd be the end of it. And I mentioned that on the other show too, that if you're looking at these things from the context that they're not a human that got turned into something, but rather its own type of entity or its own type of being, then the context fits a lot more. And like I mentioned on that show too, the whole idea of like werewolf versus dogmen, if you take out the factor of somebody getting bit and literally turning into one of these things, and you look at it from here's a creature that exists that we got to deal with, and you take out that human component, then it makes a lot more sense. Because I mean, with a lot of this, shape-shifting concepts of things. I don't think it's as literal as people think it is. Like even the Skinwalker concept, I think it's a way of knowing how to trick and manipulate people's minds. They're not literally like transforming into these creatures, you know?
Mesmerization, dazzle. That, you know how the vampires were said they could mesmerize you, you know? It's through hypnosis of sorts. But when you get into the lycopan, you know, that gets into a whole interesting subject of the Romans, you know, the pre-Romans, and they would basically have this celebration where they would wear wolf skins, and they would go out and they would like beat the women with these leather straps because they thought it made them more fertile, and they're suspected there was hallucinogens involved, but they would like eat flesh, and then they would run into the woods to basically scare all the demons away. And then they would come in and, you know, copulate for generation and, you know, the fields and whatnot.
Almost kind of reminds you of like the berserkers when it comes to like the Vikings and stuff. Cause I mean, there's a lot of like up in the air stuff, but essentially, you know, these guys would put on bear skin. They'd start kind of amping themselves up, building up. And depending on the folklore, I mean, these things would basically just like consume animals with their bare hands and stuff, and just basically just get into that primal state. So,
and you know, the berserker mushroom as far as the amanita, and they would basically eat that, and then they would recycle their urine. And they said that's when the universe would crack open, and they would basically become berserkers at that point, you know, in this altered state.
Dude, it's kind of weird to think about, though, the whole idea about consuming parts of the human body that you're not necessarily supposed to consume. I mean, you get into like the whole Bach saga concept, and I know that was something that was talked about in the community for a hot minute, and then all of a sudden it completely disappeared. But the whole concept was basically this group like consuming their own semen, and in turn becoming like bigger and stronger because they were consuming their own semen. Like, it's weird how you see these things reoccurring. It's just the excrement from the body just changes, but it still kind of gets around to the same point. But I mean, if you're looking at it, the semen aspect of it, not to get too gross with this aspect, but they talk about that being like the blood of man. So, I mean, it's still consuming blood in a different sense. It's just a different variation of blood, you know?
Right. But always within all of these sacred philosophies, the most sacred things were the white and the red. You see Egypt divided into the white and the red. You see, and you know, you have the white being the seminal fluid and the red being the starfire of the ancient, you know, Fae, and getting into all the different ritual practices that they would use these bodily fluids for, you know.
So I guess kind of starting to wrap up on this one, we're going to be diving into the Tower of Babel. But before we wrap this one up completely, man, do you have any other points or anything like that you want to be able to touch base on?
Nope. We covered a good bit of stuff, man. I thought that was fun.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, man. Like I said, it's always fun. You never know quite where you're going to go. Hopefully, we didn't get too off track from where you initially wanted to go. But I think we covered a lot of interesting stuff in the process of it, man. And I got to ask a lot of weird questions that have kind of been on my mind lately and discussing with you. And you always have a good open mind for this kind of stuff, man. So I appreciate it. Hold on tight, guys. This is our last break, so stay tuned. And we are back to the show. Let's hop right in. So I guess kind of starting to wrap up before we move into this 0.5 episode. I always like to still end with some words of wisdom, man. So if there's any words of wisdom you might be able to bestow on the listeners today, what might it be?
One of the ideas that I've kind of been looking at recently is this idea, when you go back into some of the ancient texts, they talk about the idea that there is no love without correction. You know, and when we look at our own lives and, you know, raising children, our parents raising us, you know, the necessity of at times in our lives having to make corrections just so that we don't become, you know, corrupted, you know, catch something that will harm us, you know, so we kind of have to like, in the form of knowing thyself, you also have to look at yourself internally and see the things that you might not like about yourself and do something to, you know, correct them so that you can become into a more true form of who you are as yourself.
Oh yeah, it's that inner work, man. Everybody's afraid to be able to sit by themselves in the shadows for a while and really understand yourself mentally. But I've always said, you know, you got to travel into the dark to be able to understand the dark. So if you are always scared to view your dark parts of your personality, you'll never be able to understand them and bring them into the light, and in turn become a more well-rounded, adjusted person. So, you know, don't be afraid to do that inner work. Don't be afraid to sit with your own mind, because you know, a lot of the time people are afraid to do that, but the only way to really work through that stuff is to let it hit you. You know, a lot of people just try to chase away from that, not realizing that exactly what they need is to be able to just sit in that, cope with it, and really understand it and be able to break it down for yourself on the inside. Because, you know, a lot of people pay for therapy and all that, but it's not really doing any good if you're not actually putting the stuff into practice within your own mind.
Right.
Because you can hear advice all day, but if you're not actually taking it and doing anything with it, then, you know, it's just words somebody's clearly just spatting at a wall.
Right.
And, man, if anybody wanted to possibly come and hopefully get this book, because I don't know when the exact release date is, but I know that you said it's just about there. And if people wanted to be able to come and find you on social media, and of course, you know, your origin to all this stuff, if anybody wanted to come and pick up some pieces of your awesome art, where can people come and find you across the internet, and where can people keep tabs on all of the different stuff you're doing?
Yeah, if you go to Linktree, and then RMARX, so Linktree R Marx, that will pull up all of my miscellaneous social media, my MetaMindcast podcast, all the stuff that I'm currently doing. My Patreon is on there, my Discord, all the things, all the ways you can connect with me. And I'm just basically, you know, doing art, and been spending a lot of time writing this book and kind of just living in a creative space, doing my thing, you know, so.
Well, that's awesome, man. Not a lot of people get to live that dream, and I know that every time I talk to you, you're always out traveling. You know, you're going around to different festivals, you know, meeting new people at all these festivals, doing your art, writing your books, man. Like, it's awesome that you get to do all that stuff, man. And I'm glad that you come on the show and you end up sharing all this research that you come across in the process of this, man.
I'm the nowhere man from the Yellow Submarine.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's always fun, man. I love coming on and talking. So,
if anyone would like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or through social media. Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok are the ones that I'm the most active on. Or you guys can also get a hold of me through the submission form, which is up at the top of the link tree. And the last way you guys can get a hold of me is by calling or texting the Bizarre Reality Media hotline 24/7, and that number is 313-364-1551. And if you happen to miss that or anything else, it is all available down in the show description off of the link tree. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with the mic talking about philosophy. Well, Bigfoot is stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using weed.